Kiss of Ashes. A vampire executioner falls for the very witch he's been ordered to burn. She claims only he can break the ancient fire curse that binds her family, but the closer they get, the more he realizes her magic might be devouring him from within. The stake wasn't ash yet, but it would be. Voltar could smell tomorrow in the wood, the dry promise of smoke and judgment. He stood in the rain-soaked courtyard of Blackfriars Keep, where the Covenant conducted its executions, and watched the witch kneel with iron at her wrists. She didn't look like any of the others. Not ragged. Not broken. She wore a scarlet dress that glowed even under the gray sky, and when she lifted her head, her eyes met his like flint striking steel. "Voltar," she said, sounding far too calm for a woman with a pyre behind her. "You don't believe in coincidence, do you? Coincidence is just bad pattern recognition." His voice was the clipped, bored cadence of a man who'd done this 100 times. Because he had. "Missy Caldwell, you are charged with sorcery, packcraft, and the murders at Hawthorne Lane. You'll be burned," she finished, as if the word tasted familiar. "It never takes. There were rules for executioners. Don't let them speak. Don't let them touch you." He'd always followed them until now. Something about the way the light seemed to cling to her skin, the way the rain steamed when it hit her, made him pause. "What do you mean, it never takes?" he asked, and heard the smallest crack in his discipline. She leaned forward, the iron biting. "My family is bound to the Ashen Vow. When the fire touches us, it returns to the one who set it. You burn me, executioner, and it will crawl into your veins. You will carry it. You will carry me." He almost laughed. Ancient curses were for priests and scholars, not for the blade in the dark who cleaned up after their mistakes. But when he stepped closer, the air changed. Heat coiled in his chest, as if someone were blowing on embers hidden where his heart used to be. He smelled rosemary, tallow, old parchment. Then he smelled himself singed. "Tricks," he said, but it came out softer than he wanted. "No trick," Missy said. "A lock, and you're the key. That's why they sent you. Why they always send you. You're the only one who can break it." From the ramparts, bells clanged. The Covenant magistrate had arrived. A cluster of clerics in tarred hoods moved across the stones, carrying hymn books and oil. Voltar's handler, Captain Greer, caught his eye and made a cutting gesture. "Get on with it." Voltar reached for the iron chain to haul her to the pyre. His fingers grazed her skin. Fire flared white, soundless. He staggered back, fangs dropping by reflex, not hunger. Pain bit into his forearms as fine lines seared across his skin like invisible script. Missy's breath hitched. The rain around them hissed and fell sideways, avoiding her. The clerics stopped, alarmed, their hymns turning to murmurs. "Look," she whispered, and he did. On his wrist, the burn had drawn a sigil he'd only ever seen on confiscated grimoires, a spiral of thorns, a mouth of flame, and at its center, a door. "Voltar." Greer barked, hand on sword. "What did she do?" "She didn't," Missy said, eyes on him, steady and unbearably alive. "He did." The courtyard smelled like a hearth after grief. Somewhere, a gull screamed. Voltar felt the new heat banked inside him, patient as winter kindling. He'd executed witches who begged, witches who cursed, witches who went quietly, as if the noose were a pillow. He'd never met one who gave him back his reflection and asked what he saw. "Cut her down," he said. Greer stared. "We are not in the habit of." "Do it," Voltar said, and when his gaze flicked up, every cleric looked away. They weren't afraid of Missy. They were afraid of him. He lifted her to her feet himself, iron clanking. The rain hammered suddenly harder, as if to drown the decision. Missy leaned into him for a second, only a second, and the fire in his chest steadied to a tolerable ache. "You're late," she murmured. "For what?" he asked. "For saving me," she said. "And for letting me save you back." Greer's men advanced. Voltar drew his blade, the old, honest weight of it singing through the damp. Missy's chains rattled like a warning. The pyrewood waited, cold as a promise. He had one path he knew by heart, and another he could barely see, lined with thorns and a door burning on his skin. He chose. The pyre loomed like a broken tooth against the storm clouds, but Voltar turned his back on it. His blade was an extension of his will now, a streak of silver whispering through the rain. Greer's soldiers fanned out, unsure whether to advance or flee. Their loyalty to the Covenant wavered against the raw menace of a vampire executioner turned heretic. Missy's chains clinked as she stepped closer, the rain bending around her like she was its mistress. "You just made yourself a traitor," she said, voice low but steady. "I was already one," Voltar replied. He caught Greer's sword with a quick parry, the clash ringing like a chapel bell. The heat inside his chest flared with each movement, a living coal feeding on his blood. He tasted copper, and something sweeter, her magic weaving into him like roots through stone. "Hold him," Greer shouted. Two men lunged. Voltar blurred between them, his cloak a streak of shadow. One man fell to his knees, screaming as the rain suddenly sizzled off his armor. Missy had whispered a single word under her breath. It hung in the air like a spark, then vanished. She met Voltar's eyes. "That was mercy." "Then save some for me," he growled, grabbing her by the chains and hauling her toward the east gate. The clerics scattered rather than bar his way. Behind them, the pyre caught fire anyway. Without tinder, without a torch. Flames clawed up into the sky, unnatural and hungry, and Voltar felt its pull like a brand on his soul. They didn't speak again until the keep's stone walls faded into the mist of the moorlands. Voltar finally stopped beneath a twisted yew tree, cutting the shackles with a single swipe. Missy rubbed her wrists, leaving faint trails of steam in the damp air. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked. Her voice was softer now, almost pitying. He didn't answer. The heat inside him was no longer just heat, it was movement. A subtle unfurling of something ancient and aware. It traced along his veins, testing the boundaries of his flesh, and for the first time in centuries, he felt afraid. Missy watched him with a mix of triumph and sorrow. "The curse isn't just a chain. It's a door. And you've already opened it halfway." Voltar sheathed his sword and turned, scanning the horizon. "Then we close it." She stepped closer, her breath warm against the cold. "We can't. Not without walking through." Voltar's jaw tightened. The yew tree groaned in the wind like an old sentinel, its branches creaking above them. "I don't walk through doors I don't know," he said, though the burn on his wrist throbbed like a heartbeat that wasn't his. Missy tipped her chin toward the horizon, where the distant lights of the Covenant's keep flickered like angry embers. "That's the problem. The ashen vow was written before even your kind learned to name the stars. It binds fire to blood and blood to promise. There's no map for what waits on the other side." She stepped closer, her scarlet dress torn from the escape, her bare feet leaving no mark in the mud. "Your blade can't fix this. Your orders can't burn it out. The only way is through." Voltar forced himself to meet her gaze. Her pupils were wide, reflecting the lightning across the moor. He'd seen witches beg and bluster, but she wasn't pleading. She was inviting him to risk himself, to gamble on something older and stranger than death. "I was sent to destroy you," he said quietly. "And now I'm tethered to you instead." Missy reached out, her fingers hovering near his wrist. "Not tethered. Chosen." The words sliced through him sharper than steel. Behind them, thunder rolled. The wind carried faint shouts. The Covenant would not stay stunned for long. "We have to move," Voltar said. "They'll hunt us by dawn." Missy nodded. "Then east, to the Hollow Downs. The curse roots deepest where my family first broke faith. We can't outrun it. We have to face it." They set off across the moor, the rain thinning to a mist that smelled of peat and ozone. Voltar walked half a step behind her, listening to the hush of her dress against the grass. Each footfall carried a strange tension. Every glance at her profile fed the heat inside him, but the edges of his senses told him something else. Her magic wasn't only within her anymore. It was bleeding into him, curling through his undead marrow like smoke through cracks in a door. At the downs, the land sagged inward, a bowl of ancient stones slick with moss. Missy knelt, pressing her palms to the earth. The sigils on Voltar's wrist flared in answer. "This is where they made the vow," she whispered. "The Caldwell witches bound fire to their line, and the first executioner, a vampire like you, took the oath to be its keeper. Every century, they send another to light the pyre. Every century, the fire climbs to claim its debt. Voltar crouched beside her. And you think I can end it? She looked up at him then, and for a moment, the stormlight turned her eyes molten gold. No, I think we can. But it will devour what we are to make something new. She hesitated. And that terrifies me. He reached out, almost against his will, and brushed a wet strand of hair from her cheek. Good, he said. Fear means we're still alive. The ground trembled. A subtle, living shiver beneath them. In the distance, the bells of Blackfriars Keep told the alarm. The Covenant had regrouped. Somewhere between the lightning and the thunder, Voltar thought he heard the pyre wood screaming his name. The curse wanted blood, and it didn't care whose. The air thickened until breathing felt like drinking smoke. Voltar could feel the fire curse flexing against his ribcage, testing his resolve. The sigil on his wrist pulsed, each beat synchronized with Missy's heartbeat. He could hear hers now, even over the thunder. The connection was no longer just metaphor, it was bone deep. Missy stood, mud clinging to her hem, and extended her hand. We don't have time for doubt. Her voice was steady, but her fingers trembled. Once the Covenant crosses the Downs, they'll bring iron wards and relics strong enough to tear us apart. He took her hand. The heat between their palms sizzled faintly, but didn't burn. For a heartbeat, their shared warmth felt almost human. Then tell me what to do, Voltar said. She led him to the largest of the moss-covered stones. Its surface was carved with faded spirals and flame motifs, almost lost to time. She traced the grooves, and each line lit up faintly, like embers coaxed back to life. This stone is the heart of the vow. My ancestor bound our fire here, and your ancestor, the first Voltar, swore to light it when we strayed. To break it, we have to rebind it willingly. Together. Blood for blood. Flame for flame. He frowned. Binding and rebinding. Old magic. Dangerous magic. Everything worth doing is dangerous, she said with a flicker of a smile. Even loving someone you're supposed to hate. The word loving struck him harder than a blade. For centuries he'd been a weapon, not a man. But the heat inside him twisted, hungry, hopeful. She drew a dagger from beneath her torn sleeve, a slim blade etched with runes. We'll each bleed on the stone. Then, you'll need to kiss me. The kiss seals the vow. His laugh was short and bitter. A fairy tale solution? A fairy tale curse, she said. They rhyme. Lightning ripped the sky as he nicked his palm, watching black-red blood drip onto the glowing carvings. Missy followed, her crimson mingling with his, the stone hissing like quenched steel. The Downs seemed to exhale, mist swirling around them. She stepped close, lifting her chin. Now, Voltar. For an instant he hesitated, not because of fear, but because of memory, the faces of witches he'd burned, the orders he'd obeyed without question. Then he bent and kissed her. The world ignited. Not in pain, but in revelation. Flame roared around them without heat, lifting them weightless. Visions flooded him, lives lived and lost, every Caldwell witch who had knelt here, every executioner who had doubted. He saw himself, not as a monster, but as a man standing on the edge of choice. When the light receded, they were still standing, but the stone had cracked down its center, smoke curling from its heart. The sigil on his wrist was gone. Missy stared at him, tears glistening like rain. It's done, she whispered. Voltar wasn't sure. Deep in his chest, the fire still flickered, but now it pulsed in time with something softer. The horizon glowed faintly with the torches of the approaching Covenant soldiers. He tightened his grip on her hand. Done or not, we're not staying to find out. They sprinted across the moor, the mist parting before them. Behind them, the ancient stones of the hollow Downs trembled and toppled, the old vow collapsing with them. The sky above flickered with strange auroras, a sign that some ancient balance had shifted. As they reached the ridge, Missy glanced back once. Do you feel it? She asked. The curse. It's not a curse anymore, Voltar interrupted, surprising himself. It's a beginning. Below, the moor stretched endless and wild. Ahead lay unknown roads, pursuit, and a future written in ash and blood. Yet, for the first time in centuries, Voltar felt something startlingly alive, a fragile, dangerous hope, blazing brighter than any fire. The horizon broke open into dawn, a pale orange bruising the storm clouds. Voltar slowed, listening to the land, the murmur of wet grass underfoot, the distant shouts of men who thought themselves righteous, the heartbeat of the witch beside him. Missy's hand was small but unyielding in his. They paused on a ridge where the earth fell away into a valley of heather and foxglove. From this height, the Covenant's torches looked like wandering stars, too far away to matter just yet. But Voltar knew pursuit when he felt it. They would regroup, bring hunters and holy water, maybe even another vampire from the old ranks who hadn't yet betrayed them. Missy bent, scooping a handful of damp soil, letting it sift through her fingers. "This valley," she said, "was my mother's refuge. She hid here after they took my sisters." She said the downs whispered to her even then. Voltar watched her profile in the dim light. He could see traces of exhaustion, lines of worry etched young, but also a wild glint in her eyes. "What did they whisper?" he asked. "That nothing stays burned forever." She straightened, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Fire destroys, but it also clears the field for what's next. My family forgot that part." The heat in his chest pulsed, softer now but undeniably alive. He hated the way it made him feel vulnerable, but he also couldn't deny the clarity it brought. For centuries, his existence had been duty and death deficient, bloodless in its cruelty. Now, standing beside a witch he should have killed, he felt the absurdity of his own history. A hawk wheeled overhead, its cry sharp as a blade. Voltar's eyes tracked it until it vanished into the clouds. "If we keep running," he said, "they'll chase us until the world ends." "Then we don't run," Missy replied. "We build." She pointed eastward, where the valley narrowed into a gorge. "There's a cavern there, warded by old blood. My great-grandmother bound a spirit to guard it. We can rest, plan," and her voice faltered slightly, "and learn what this bond between us really is." The thought unsettled him more than a dozen armed soldiers. "You trust me in a cavern?" "I trust what you chose tonight," she said. "You could have walked away. You didn't." Voltar looked back toward the flicker of Covenant torches. He imagined Greer's fury, the cleric's hymns turning vengeful. The Covenant had always believed fire could purify anything. Now the fire had chosen otherwise. He reached for Missy's hand again. "Show me the cavern." She smiled faintly and started down the slope. As they moved, the world seemed subtly altered, the heather brighter, the air clearer, as if the curses breaking had rinsed some ancient dust from reality. And beneath Voltar's ribs, that fragile flame, once a threat, now felt like a heartbeat that wasn't his alone. They descended into the gorge, where water trickled over smooth stones and the shadows deepened. Missy found a narrow cleft in the rock, half hidden by ferns, and pressed her palm to a carved spiral on the stone face. The air shivered as the entrance opened, revealing a passage lit by faint, ghostly fire. Voltar ducked inside, the cavern's chill wrapping around them. The ghostly flames flickered along the walls, casting light without heat. Missy's shoulders slumped relief, or maybe the weight of what they'd done finally catching her. "Here," she said, leading him deeper. "This place remembers everything. Even the truths we'd rather forget." Voltar stepped closer, letting the eerie light etch her features into his memory. The Covenant's world was ashes now. Ahead of them, in this strange hollow of earth and fire, something new waited to be built. Something neither witch nor vampire had dared to imagine. They moved deeper into the cavern until the walls widened into a cathedral of stone. Columns of limestone rose like petrified trees, and a subterranean river murmured through the darkness. The ghostly fire along the walls flickered in recognition of Missy, curling upward in soft arcs, as if greeting an heir. Voltar watched the glow touch her cheekbones and caught a pang of something unfamiliar, awe. For centuries he'd faced witches with disdain or indifference. But here, in this ancient hollow, she didn't seem like prey or rival. She seemed like a force of nature that had been waiting for him longer than he could fathom. Missy approached a pool at the cavern's center. Its surface shimmered faintly, reflecting not just their faces, but images that weren't there. Forests burning, stars collapsing, a child's laughter. "This is the vow's echo," she whispered. "The magic remembers every choice tied to the fire." Voltar knelt beside her, the cold stone biting through his trousers. He peered into the water and flinched. His own reflection was gone. Instead, he saw himself cradling a newborn swaddled in scarlet, standing beside Missy beneath a sky awash in auroras. He saw torches falling from the hands of Covenant soldiers, their flames extinguished by unseen winds. "That's impossible," he muttered. "Vampires don't dream futures." "It's not a dream," she said quietly. "It's a possibility. The fire's offering us a path." The heat in his chest pulsed in response, a steady drumbeat. He didn't like the idea of magic guiding him, but he couldn't deny the pull. He glanced at her, the witch who had every reason to hate him. "What if it's lying? Then we make it a truth," she said. For a long while, they sat in silence, listening to the river's song. Above them, drops of water fell like measured seconds. The weight of centuries pressed against Voltar's shoulders, every order obeyed, every life taken. He'd lived so long as an executioner that he'd forgotten there were choices beyond the blade. Missy reached for his hand again. The moment their skin met, the flames on the walls surged, illuminating a carved archway on the far side of the chamber, a door of stone framed by runes that hummed with restrained power. "That's where the vow's root lies," she said. "If we cross it, there's no going back. Your covenant, my family, everything we were, unmade." Voltar stared at the door. The fire curse that had once felt like a shackle now felt like a pulse urging him forward. He thought of Greer's soldiers closing in, of the endless chain of pyres and ashes, of the hollow eternity he'd endured. "Then we stepped through," he said. Missy's lips curved in a smile that was equal parts hope and defiance. Together they rose, the witch and the vampire executioner, and walked toward the stone door. The runes flared as they approached, casting their shadows high against the cavern walls, two figures bound not by duty or curse, but by a choice that might remake the world. Behind them, the echoes of the old vow faded like dying embers. Ahead of them, firelight and possibility waited, burning brighter than any pyre. The runes blazed white-hot as Voltar and Missy pressed their palms to the stone door. Heat seared their skin, not pain this time, but a fierce, awakening warmth. The door split with a low groan, revealing a corridor of light so bright it seemed to hum. Stepping through felt like diving into a sunrise. The cavern behind them dissolved into motes of fire, and for a dizzying moment Voltar sensed every flame that had ever burned. Torches on ancient battlefields, hearthfires in forgotten homes, the brief flicker of candles before lovers' confessions. The fire wasn't cruel or hungry, it was memory itself, longing to be understood. Missy stumbled and grabbed his arm. "This isn't a place," she said, her voice trembling. "It's the fire's heart." The corridor expanded into a boundless plain of light. Far away, shadows shaped like the Covenant's hunters prowled, but they melted before reaching them. Between breaths, Voltar felt his fangs recede, felt the edges of his hunger dull. He wasn't less than he'd been, he was more, layered with something that had waited for centuries to be carried forward. A voice, not a sound, but a resonance in his bones spoke. "Vowbreakers. Vowmakers. Choose." Missy looked at him. Fear and resolve warred in her eyes. "If we walk away now," she whispered, "the Covenant rebuilds. My family keeps running. And you," she touched his chest where the flame pulsed. "You burn slowly from the inside until nothing's left." He thought of all the witches whose lives he'd taken without ever wondering who they were. Of nights spent sharpening his blade, mistaking obedience for meaning. Of the fleeting peace in Missy's kiss. Voltar squeezed her hand. "Then we choose to break the world." They stepped forward together. The fire surged, coiling around them like a living tide. Their bodies dissolved into warmth and light, two threads twisting into a single, luminous braid. When sensation returned, they were standing on a grassy hillside beneath an unfamiliar sky. Dawn painted the clouds with streaks of emerald and gold. Below them, villages dotted the valley, but none bore the Covenant's banners. There were no pyres, no soldiers, only farmers tending fields, children chasing one another, and a sense of stillness that felt impossible. Missy knelt, touching the soil. "It's changed. We changed it." Voltar scanned the horizon. The heat in his chest had settled into a steady thrum, a companion rather than a threat. He could feel her presence threaded through it. He turned to her, searching for words, and found none that could contain the enormity of what they'd done. She saved him the trouble, offering a small, tired smile. "Looks like we're fugitives in a world we just remade." He barked a laugh. Rough, unpracticed. "Then let's live like it matters." She reached for his hand. "Where to?" "Anywhere but back," he said. "Forward, until the fire finds a new story." Together they descended the hillside, their silhouettes merging with the dawn. Behind them, the ashes of old vows scattered on a wind that no longer belonged to the Covenant, carrying whispers of a world reborn from flame. They crossed the valley as the day unfolded, sunlight breaking in clean shards across the fields. Every color felt sharper now, the green of the grass almost impossibly vivid, the sky a deep, living blue. Villagers paused their work to stare at the pair, an unarmed vampire with an executioner's bearing and a witch with firelight in her hair, yet no one raised an alarm. In this remade world, perhaps such a sight carried no old fear. By evening, Voltar and Missy reached a small inn on the outskirts of a forest. Its sign, carved with a stag leaping through flames, swung gently in the breeze. Inside, the inn smelled of wood smoke and fresh bread. The barkeep, a plump woman with kind eyes, greeted them as if they were any weary travelers. Voltar felt the absence of suspicion like a hollow in his chest. In the old world, villagers would have whispered witch and monster before the door had even closed. They ate by the hearth, steam rising from bowls of stew. Missy cupped her spoon between both hands, savoring the warmth. "Do you think the Covenant exists here at all?" she asked. Voltar considered. Maybe it never formed. Maybe fire was never twisted into punishment. He stared into the flames in the hearth, half expecting them to speak again. Or maybe it's waiting in some other shape. Missy studied him. "You'd fight them again?" He met her gaze, a small smile ghosting his lips. "I'd build something better first. Fighting alone, that's just another kind of vow." Later, in the room they rented above the common room, the world outside seemed distant. Missy stood by the window, watching starlight scatter across unfamiliar constellations. Voltar joined her, leaning against the frame. The heat in his chest, the tether between them, thrummed softly, no longer urgent, just present. "You realize," she said, "our families and histories are dust. We're not bound by anything anymore." "Then let's choose what binds us," he replied. The simplicity of the words startled him, but it felt right. She turned to face him fully, her expression open and unguarded. "You were supposed to be my executioner." "And you," he said, brushing a lock of hair from her face, "were supposed to be my lesson." She laughed quietly, a sound like water over stone. They stood together until the stars blurred, until even their scars felt like memories from another life. Somewhere beyond the hills, the future waited, uncharted, dangerous, alive. At dawn, they left the inn without fanfare, following a road that didn't exist in the world they'd known. Birds sang unfamiliar songs overhead. The horizon glowed with promise. Voltar glanced at Missy, her scarlet dress catching the light, and for the first time in centuries, he felt like the story ahead of him wasn't already written. Hand in hand, they walked toward the unknown, two vowbreakers carrying the kiss of ashes into a world ready for new fire. Days bled into weeks as Voltar and Missy followed roads that weren't on any map. They discovered villages built around living trees that sang when the wind touched their leaves, and streams that whispered in languages older than mountains. Each place felt like a fragment of a world healed by their choice, a world that had been quietly waiting for someone to break the old cycle. In a cliffside town where the clouds grazed the rooftops, they heard rumors. No pyres had been lit in generations. Children practiced charms in daylight without fear. Travelers spoke of a vampire who'd refused a king's order to kill a witch and how the skies had burned emerald that night. The story had already twisted into legend, but Voltar saw Missy's small, secret smile each time someone repeated it. They began to build a life not as fugitives, but as planters of seeds. In a riverside village, Missy healed a farmer's blighted field by coaxing the soil to remember its own fertility. In another, Voltar taught young smiths how to temper blades without hate in their hearts. Every act was small, but together they wove a quiet rebellion against the old world's cruelties. One evening, under a canopy of lantern-lit trees, they joined a midsummer festival. Dancers spun around a fire that burned without consuming, its flames taking the shape of stags and birds before dissolving into sparks. Missy watched the flames with a soft wonder, then turned to Voltar. "Does it feel strange?" she asked. "Being part of the dance, not the executioner in the shadows?" He thought for a long moment. "It feels earned. And frightening." She tilted her head. "Frightening?" He met her gaze. "Because for the first time, I want the story to last." They danced then, awkwardly at first, her scarlet hem tangling around his boots, his hands unsure without a blade to hold. But the music was forgiving, and so was the world they'd saved. As the festival wound down and the last embers floated skyward, Missy leaned against him. "The fire isn't done with us," she murmured. Voltar traced a finger along the scar on his wrist where the sigil had once burned. "No," he agreed. "But maybe, for once, it's on our side." In the years that followed, their legend spread further than either had imagined. Ballads called them the Ashen Lovers, the Vow-breakers, the ones who chose. The Covenant, if it still existed somewhere, became a cautionary tale told to children about what happens when power forgets mercy. And when storms swept the valleys and lightning clawed the sky, villagers sometimes claimed to see two silhouettes walking hand in hand on distant ridgelines, a witch with fire in her veins and a vampire who had once been her executioner, wandering a world reborn from their defiance. They were not seeking a final destination. They were carrying the flame forward into futures unwritten, proof that even vows carved in stone could be shattered, and that even in the ashes of old worlds, new fires could bloom. Years rolled forward, and the roads carried Voltar and Missy into lands where even the stars seemed different. Empires rose and fell quietly on distant horizons, but the couple moved like a rumor between them, never lingering too long, never fully belonging, but leaving warmth in their wake. They settled for a while in a remote mountain village where the wind sang through crystal caves. There, Missy tended gardens that bloomed even in frost, and Voltar carved intricate sigils into the wooden beams of homes to ward off storms. The villagers never asked for their story. They simply accepted that a witch and a vampire had chosen to live among them. At night, Voltar would stand outside, watching auroras ripple across the sky. Sometimes, when Missy was asleep, he'd whisper thanks to the fire still nestled in his chest. It hadn't diminished, it had changed. It no longer devoured, it warmed. One winter, a group of travelers arrived bearing fragments of the old world, a covenant banner, frayed and weather-stained. They spoke of a remnant, a zealot faction that had survived the unraveling of history and now sought to rebuild the pyres. Their leader, they said, claimed a vision, that the Ashen Lovers must be found and destroyed, lest their new world be fully reborn. Missy listened, her face pale but determined. When the travelers left, she turned to Voltar. "We could hide." He shook his head. "We could," he agreed. "But we won't." They didn't wait for the threat to find them. They left the village under starlight, following old instincts, not to destroy, but to protect what they'd built. The journey was harder this time. Years had added weight to their bones and tenderness to their hearts, but the bond between them burned brighter than ever. They found the remnants' camp on the edge of a desolate plain, a place where the wind carried ghosts of forgotten vows. The zealot's pyre stood half-built, its wood gray and brittle. Voltar stepped forward, sword drawn not in anger, but in promise. Missy stood beside him, her palms alive with fire that danced like ribbons of dawn. The zealot leader, a gaunt priest with hollow eyes, sneered. "You unmade the world's order. "No," Missy said, her voice carrying like a bell. "We unmade its cruelty." The wind rose, scattering the firewood like dry leaves. Flames leapt from Missy's hands, consuming the remnants of the Covenant banner. Voltar lowered his blade, but didn't sheath it. His presence was enough to scatter those who still clung to old hate. When the plane was empty, Missy reached for his hand. "We're still choosing," she whispered. "Every day," Voltar replied. They turned from the ruins of the old order and walked on, leaving only ashes behind. Somewhere ahead, new fires waited to be lit, not pyres of punishment, but hearths of possibility. And as long as they walked together, the world would keep remaking itself beneath their feet. Seasons blurred, and the world seemed to breathe easier in their wake. In quiet villages, children spoke their names as charms for courage. In sprawling cities, street bards sang of the Ashen Lovers, and the night the sky burned emerald. Voltar and Missy never sought to rule or even to guide, but their passage left seeds. People planting kindness where cruelty had once thrived, flames now warming instead of devouring. One autumn, they paused their wandering in a coastal town perched above a restless sea. Waves crashed against black cliffs, and gulls wheeled overhead, their cries like laughter. They rented a modest cottage near the lighthouse, its windows glowing with the amber light of lanterns. For the first time in years, they let themselves stay. Missy took to teaching local children small magics, charms for safe travel, whispers to coax herbs into flourishing. She never spoke of curses or pyres. Voltar mended nets with the fishermen and told stories by the fire on stormy nights, leaving out his fangs and his centuries of blood. On a windswept evening, the two of them walked the cliff's edge, cloaks snapping in the salt air. The lighthouse beams swept the horizon in steady arcs. Voltar stopped, gazing at the infinite black water. "I used to think eternity was an endless repetition," he said quietly. "Now I think it's this, a moment that matters enough to remember." Missy slipped her hand into his. "Then let's make enough of them to fill forever." Years later, a child in that town, grown into a cartographer, would draw a map of the coast and label that Cliff Lover's Firelight Point. It became a place where couples came to whisper vows, not because they feared curses, but because they believed in choosing love over fear. Voltar and Missy eventually moved on, as they always did. The world kept remaking itself. New towns, new songs, new stories. Sometimes they arrived where their legend had already outpaced them, the details twisted into myths of dragons and gods. Sometimes they found places that knew nothing of them at all, and in those places, they began again, quietly, as travelers with no past. One winter night, while camped beneath unfamiliar constellations, Missy traced circles in the frost with her fingertip. "Do you think," she murmured, "that fire ever regrets burning?" Voltar leaned back, the stars mirrored in his dark eyes. "Only when it forgets it can warm." The fire between them crackled gently. In its glow, they looked less like fugitives and more like keepers of a fragile light. They had broken a vow, shattered an order, rewritten the sky, and yet, what endured was not the blaze of rebellion, but the quiet flame they carried onward, a choice renewed with every step, every dawn, every kiss of ashes that promised beginnings instead of ends. Far ahead, the horizon shimmered with endless roads. They rose together, clasped hands, and walked toward the next unwritten chapter, the fire in their chests steady and sure, lighting a path no map could hold. Decades passed, though neither Voltar nor Missy wore the years heavily. The world they'd remade had grown into something they could barely recognize. Cities where magic and craft coexisted without fear, old forests unscarred by torches, and communities where children learned both swordplay and spellcraft as tools of creation, not destruction. They had settled for a time in a bustling trade city, its streets lined with floating lanterns that drifted like low stars. Voltar worked as a night watchman along the docks, quiet work that let him study the rhythm of tides, while Missy opened a small apothecary where sailors and scholars came for charms against storms or for stories whispered over herbs. One evening, while they sat on the rooftop garden watching ships' lanterns flicker across the bay, a messenger arrived, A young woman with eyes like polished amber and a letter sealed with an unfamiliar crest. She bowed low and handed the scroll to Missy. Missy broke the seal, scanning the elegant script. Her brows furrowed. They've found traces of the Covenant's scripture in the southern deserts. Someone is trying to gather the fragments to rebuild the old ways. Voltar's jaw tightened. The fire inside him flickered, not in fear, but in warning. We knew ghosts of the old order might rise again. She met his gaze. We can't just destroy them. Not again. Destruction isn't enough. He nodded slowly. Then we teach them why the old ways failed. Their journey took them across dunes that glowed like embers at sunset, through caravans where storytellers wove myths of the Ashen Lovers into song. At an ancient ruin half swallowed by sand, they found a circle of zealots poring over broken stone tablets. But these zealots were different, young, curious, and uncertain. Missy stepped into the circle, her voice carrying authority without arrogance. The fire you seek is not punishment. It's memory. It doesn't need pyres, it needs understanding. The young leader, barely more than a boy, lowered his hood. You're them. Voltar smiled faintly. Two travelers. Nothing more. But the boy shook his head. You're proof that even vows carved in fire can be remade. They stayed among the zealots for a season, not to lead, but to listen. Voltar sparred with their warriors, showing them discipline without cruelty. Missy shared her knowledge of flame that heals and nourishes. Slowly, the zealots abandoned the remnants of the Covenant's old fury. When the first spring storm swept the desert, lightning danced harmlessly across the sands instead of igniting them. The sky above glowed emerald once more, a sign, perhaps, that the world approved. That night, Voltar and Missy stood on a dune, watching the auroras ripple. She leaned against him, her hair tangled by the wind. We've been so many things to so many people, executioner and witch, fugitives, legends, teachers. And what are we now? Voltar asked quietly. She turned to him, her eyes luminous in the strange light. We're the ones who keep walking. He kissed her forehead, and for the first time, he realized eternity wasn't a burden. It was an open road. The fire in his chest, their fire, burned steady, lighting a path through a world endlessly reborn. Together, they stepped forward once more, leaving footprints in the sand that the wind would erase, but whose echo would ripple through every flame yet to be lit. Years melted into centuries, and the world continued to turn beneath their feet. Civilizations rose with new names, and old borders crumbled into dust. The songs about the Ashen Lovers faded into folklore, then into half-remembered lullabies sung to restless children on stormy nights. But Voltar and Missy, unchanged except for the deepened light in their eyes, remained, two steady flames in an ever-shifting world. They wandered through lands where forests glowed with bioluminescent blossoms and through cities suspended in the clouds by airships powered with gentle, living magic. In every place, they planted sparks of kindness, a word here, a mended heart there. They had long since abandoned any idea of saving the world in grand gestures. They knew now that true change happened quietly, in a shared meal, a forgiven mistake, a small fire warming cold hands. One winter, they returned to the valley where the hollow downs had once stood. The stones were gone, the land unscarred. A green sweep of meadow alive with wildflowers. Standing in the grass where the old vow had burned, they felt the weight of history's. Missy knelt, brushing her fingers over a cluster of white blossoms. It's like it never happened, she said softly. Voltar crouched beside her, the wind teasing his dark hair. It happened. The world just healed. They stayed until sunset, watching the sky flush with gold and violet. As twilight deepened, the first stars winked alive, different constellations now, as if even the heavens had rewritten themselves. Missy leaned against him. Do you ever wish we'd stopped, settled somewhere, lived just one ordinary life? He thought of the roads they'd walked, the people they'd touched, the laughter they'd kindled in places once ruled by fear. He thought of the way her hand always found his, no matter the century. No, he said finally. Every step with you has been its own ordinary life. She smiled, tears glinting in the starlight. Then this is enough. They watched the horizon a while longer, the air cool and clean. Then they rose, fingers entwined, and began walking again. No destination, no urgency, just forward. Behind them, the meadow swayed gently, carrying whispers of old ashes on a soft wind. Ahead of them, a new dawn waited, unwritten. Somewhere, in the cradle of memory and myth, the world held its breath, and the fire they'd carried for lifetimes burned steady, a reminder that even the fiercest flames can become a hearth, and even the oldest vows can be remade. And so the Ashen lovers walked on, eternal travelers beneath ever-changing skies, their kiss of ashes not an ending, but a promise that love and choice could light the dark again and again, as long as there were roads to follow and dawns yet to come. Please remember to subscribe so you don't miss out on new stories like this daily.